I grew up outside of Copenhagen. Most of my life spent on my father's sheep farm. It's beautiful country if you've never been, and I can think of no better place to spend my childhood. The rolling hills and forests are perfect for playing knights or policemen or whatever a child may want. The trees became my castles, the underbridges my banks or shops to chase robbers from, and I spent the hours outside of my chores letting my imagination run wild. That imagination was probably why no one believed me when I told them about the ravens. I'd been telling tales since I was very young. I claimed I'd seen fairies dancing around a mushroom ring. I'd seen a parade of lights that had turned out to be the procession of Queen Mab, that I had seen dinosaurs in the forest, and black dogs, and kelpies, and all sorts of things. I loved stories, so I wanted to see something magical. The world was often such a dour place that I prayed for a little magic in my life, and created it until I could find my wish fulfilled. I was 9 when I found some of that magic, but I wasn't quite as ready as I believed I was. My grandparents lived less than a mile from our farm. Their property was at the back end of ours, truth be told, and when my gran called and said she had just baked a bunch of cookies and was hoping I could come help her eat some of the extras, I turned hopefully to my mum and asked if I could go over for some cookies. Mum asked if my chores were done, and I said they were. It was summer. I wouldn't have to go fill the sheep feeders till after dinner. I'd been diligent through the day, and now my midday was mine to do what I liked. "You may," Mum said, "but put on your slicker and your wellies. It looks like rain." A few minutes later, I was set out in my duck-yellow slicker with my big green rubber gum boots on an adventure to Grandma's house. I found a stick on the way, my sword for this quest, and I was cutting through the sheep fields and heading for the little path between the fields. It was a place I liked to play sometimes, and my grandfather had told me it had once been the site of a great battle. He said old Danish kings were known to make war on each other, and the land around Copenhagen had seen a lot of bloodshed over the years. The area between the farms, but a quarter-mile of dirt road, was said to have been the site of several skirmishes, and I wonder now how many had lost their lives there. As a child, however, it was just fun to think of knights fighting each other as their steel clanged and the horses whinnied. I heard the thunder rumble, something that was not the loud sound of hooves charging forward, and thought that Mum was right. The rain would be coming soon. If I didn't want to get wet, I needed to hurry. Getting wet wasn't really something I was too worried about, but Gran liked to keep the house nice and dry, and a wet little boy was likely to be asked to leave after he'd eaten only a few cookies. I came out onto the road, racing the rain, but I wasn't alone. Perched on the wooden fence which separated the road from the fields were ravens. I don't mean crows or blackbirds. I mean ravens. If you've never seen them together, then you might not understand, but ravens are quite a bit larger than crows. They are more than a little scary looking too, especially to a child not yet 10. I expected they would take flight when I came onto the road, but they did not. They sat looking at me like hateful old men watching a trespasser, and it was clear that they would not leave simply because I was there. They were proud birds, and this was their place, and it was I who was the interloper. It was spooky, but I wasn't really afraid of them. I was a little scared. There were a lot of them, and I was a small boy. but I didn't think they would hurt me. These were no boogeymen, no trolls or goblins, and they were more spooky than scary. Papa put out straw men to keep these devils out of the garden. They were birds, and birds couldn't hurt me. "Boy," said a voice, and I froze in my tracks. "Boy," it said again, and I looked around to see who had spoken. Was it one of the ravens? Ravens could speak. I'd heard that somewhere, and maybe these ravens had picked up a word or two. Mum said ravens were smart after all, so it wasn't that hard to imagine that it could be them talking. I kept walking, trying not to look at them as I went. They were just birds. They didn't want anything from me. Birds didn't talk to people. They just, "Boy, stop," the same croaky voice said. That drew me up short. The bird had told me to stop, so I had. I felt a chill run up my spine as I turned to look at the group of crows. A murder. It was a murder when it was crows. And I saw one that was different. His feathers were white. They weren't gray. They were snow white. His beak and legs were black, the color his feathers ought to be, but his eyes were the most frightening part of him. They were red, like a rat's eyes, and they stared at me with far too much intelligence. We just stood there for a while, staring at each other as the thunder built overhead, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing was still just a bird, so it had two words. What of it? Didn't mean it was different from the rest or anything. "Thank you, boy," it said, its speech perfectly understandable, if not a little raspy. "I was not sure you would stop for a moment. I have to ask a favor of you, but in return I will grant you any wish you desire." I looked around, expecting to see someone standing nearby throwing their voice, but it was just me and the ravens. The thunder rumbled again overhead, but the rain coming on fast behind me was the least of my concerns. Now I was more worried about the talking raven with the white feathers. I started to say, not sure how to answer. "Are you talking to me?" The raven appeared to chuckle, a clicking sound that the others picked up quickly. "Well, who else would I be talking to? You and I are the only ones talking out here, are we not?" I nodded, supposing that was so. "So I am here to offer you your heart's desire in exchange for a favor of my asking. Do you agree?" I started to nod. I was very close to just nodding before learning more, but Papa had always been very clear about blindly accepting things. Papa was a man who had worked to get where he was, and he always told me to be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. Anyone who wants you to sign on the dotted line without letting you read the contract is trying to trick you out of something, and it's often something you wouldn't want to try to live without, he would say, and I remembered his words in the nick of time. "How is it that you can talk?" I asked, and the bird ruffled a little at the question. "Well, ravens are smart, everyone knows this, but I am a Valravn, and I am smarter than any of my brethren. Do you know why?" I did know why, as it happened. Grandfather had told me about the Valravns, just as he had told me about the trolls and the gnomes and the other magical creatures that inhabit our old world. "Valravns are ravens that have eaten the flesh of a king," I said, and the bird seemed to smile as much as a beak could smile. "Very close, boy, Valravns have eaten the heart of a king. It was right here, actually, a very long time ago. Would you like to hear about it?" I nodded. Very much. My grandfather told me this place had seen many battles. "Your grandfather is wise," the white bird said. "I was barely in my first year when I saw the pinions and banners waving. We were more interested in the men carrying them, however, my murder and I. In those days, when men with banners went somewhere, they were often bodies in the place where they stopped to do battle. Banners we were following that day. They did not do well, and we fell on them after the fighting was done and ate our fill. I found him then, the man with the shiny hat. I did not know he was a king, not then. I only knew that his hat had caught the light when the sun came out from behind a cloud, and it drew me to him. His armor was broken, and his blood was running free. Someone had pierced his heart with a lance, and I ate it happily. It was meat, and meat was good. But as I ate, I began to know things. I knew that the meat was a heart, and the hat was a crown, and the king was named Lenthal. His castle was far from here, in a place called Wales, and he would never go home again. Never again. I also knew something else. I knew I would never die until I gained what I needed. I would never truly live. That is why I need you, boy. You have what I need, and to get it, I am willing to make a deal with you. Whatever you desire shall be yours, but only if you agree to give me what I need." For the second time that day, I was prepared to agree. My family was not rich, though we were better than most, and there were things I needed, just like any child. A new bike, a box kite, a real sword, a horse, a stable of horses. I could have anything I wanted. The Valravn was magic. Grandfather had said so. But as I opened my mouth, I remembered something else Grandfather had told me. The Valravn is a smart but tricksy bird. It knows it can only be human if it gains what it most desires, he had said, puffing his pipe as he sat before the fire. "And what does it most desire, Grandfather?" I asked, scooting a little closer as I waited for him to tell. I expected it to be treasure, or a magic book, or true love, or something from the usual stories, but it was much worse than that. My grandfather leaned back and looked me in the eye as he delivered the answer, and I realized now that it had been intended to scare me. Grandfather believed in the things he talked about, trolls and redcaps and Valravn, and he wanted me to be wary of them as well. After that night, I certainly was wary, and it surprises me now that it took me so long to remember that night as I sat before the fire, listening to the tales. "A child's heart," he almost whispered, and as I stood there in the road, I heard that same whisper creep up my spine like a spider in the dead of night. "Do we have a deal?" the Valravn asked, but I was already backing away. I shouldn't have talked to it. I shouldn't have stopped. And as I began to run, I heard the Valravn quark angrily as the murder took flight. I was running as fast as I could, the raindrops beginning to fall as my feet ate up the ground. I could see the lane that would take me to my grandparents' house, but it looked miles long as the beat of wings sounded behind me. There were so many of them, a whole murder of them, and I fancied that my slicker rustled as they dove at me. The rain was falling hard now, the drops becoming a downpour, and I expected their talons to find me any minute. When the angry quark began to sound behind me, I looked back to see them flying drunkenly as the rain soaked them. Later I would find out that birds don't usually fly in the rain because it makes their feathers heavy, which makes their movements difficult and their steering and maintaining flight almost impossible. If they had come after me on a sunny day, I would have been ripped apart. Ravens are large, and in such numbers, I would have been unable to hold them off. Instead, the rain thwarted them, and I made it to my grandparents' house in one piece. Grandma was a little miffed at the mud and the water that I had tracked in, but I think she realized something was wrong when she found me curled up in a corner of her mudroom in tears. She asked me what had happened, clearly afraid that someone had tried to snatch me or some such thing, but I just kept shaking my head and whispering, "Valravn, Valravn," until she called my grandfather from the den and asked him what I was saying. Grandfather listened. He nodded, and then he took me in his arms and brought me into the den to sit by the fire. Grandmother came in a few minutes later with cookies and milk, and we sat and listened to the rain, Grandfather asking me if I'd seen one of the tricksy birds. I nodded, and he nodded in return. That was all that was ever said about it. After my cookies were eaten, he put me in his old truck and took me home. We never spoke of it again, and it was never brought up between anyone after that. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.